Welcome to another episode of Brainworms.
Woo! Thank you for coming back. If you're coming back, welcome for the first time. If this is the first episode you're listening to. Today's episode 5, and as usual, we'll be deep diving into some cool and fun and fresh topics. Okay, Joe, you're up first this week. What are you going to be talking about today?
So a few episodes ago, I told you about the prehistory of Dungeons and Dragons. And today I want to talk about something very related. So I've been playing Dungeons and Dragons for, several years now. We both have. And before that, I was sort of obsessed with Dungeons and Dragons since I was a kid. I didn't have anybody to play with, but I did have some books that my stepmom gave to me. I've been curious for a while now about other tabletop role-playing games that are not D&D. And so I took this as an opportunity to explore in more depth what some of the other options out there are, what they're like, and now I want to tell you about them. So today I'm going to be talking about tabletop role-playing games other than D&D. So first, I have a question for you. How did you play as a child? Make-believe or, what kind of ways did you like to play, if that question makes sense?
No, it does. I definitely played make-believe a lot. I guess I don't think about it that way, but that's basically what I was doing. My cousin and I would make up our own games. We were heavily into Barbie dolls. That's honestly a lot of what we did. It was taking our Barbie dolls and putting them in different scenarios. We had all of these other toy components that went with the Barbie dolls, like a cruise ship. They had cars. We had all these different things to put them in different scenarios to create a storyline, give it a narrative, if you will. And we got really, really into it.
That sort of is the next question I was going to ask is with your Barbies, types of scenarios did you put them in? So in particular, were they physically fighting each other?
I don't think so. Not that I remember. Not unless there was drama, I suppose, but they weren't duking it out. It was no, I'm mad at her because she stole my boyfriend, that type of stuff.
Right. Yeah, so these questions are sort of leading in a particular direction. If in your childhood your main sort of make-believe was not fighting, it could be the case that your basically grown-up version of make-believe doesn't have to necessarily be focused primarily on fighting. There's other kinds of make-believe, and reflective of that is that there are tabletop role-playing games that are not focused on purely fighting. It can be a component. It can be there. It can be the last resort when all the tension breaks and the last resort is that you have to start resorting to punching each other or something. But there's a lot of other aspects to make-believe than fighting. Dungeons and Dragons, as I, highlighted in my previous episode about this, came out of war games, right? The whole point was fighting. To be fair, fighting is a very popular way of playing make-believe as a kid, right? I definitely did, play fighting as a kid. I'd get sticks and we'd play swords. That's a thing that people do, right? So it's fine, but there's other things that D&D simply does not explore. So basically I've made a list of games that are tabletop role-playing games, right? So they're, D&D-esque in the basic setup of what we're doing. But these games are focused on other things. They change it up in some kind of a way. So I want to tell you about them. I looked at several games, and this list in particular are the games that I would be very interested in actually trying in the near future.
Cool. I'm excited to hear about it.
So just to be clear, all the games I'm going to talk about right now, I have not played. This is just my, initial research, trying to get a gist of what the vibes are like and see which of these sounds appealing to me and I think could be appealing to other people. So the first one I'm going to tell you about is Vampire the Masquerade. It's not a very new one. It was first published in 1991, and as you can probably tell from the title, it's mainly focused on vampires. So in this game, all the characters are vampires. The basic setup is you are a freshly minted, brand new vampire, and you have to deal with what that entails. So you're going to have a blood hunger, and you have to feed it. You know, you have to feed on blood. But then there's also everything else that you would expect from like a vampire movie. You know, there's like intrigue and like drama and complicated social hierarchy stuff that you see in movies like Interview with a Vampire or things along those lines.
This sounds like it could have fighting in it, or at least violence. Well, you said blood. What did you say? Blood hungry? Mm-hmm. And I was like, Also, might I pitch, if it doesn't already exist, a new version of this that involves Twilight?
I mean, they definitely have a lot of versions, a lot of updates. There are new versions are coming out, you know, every couple of years.
There has to be a Twilight one then.
There's at the very least, there's definitely like a homebrew, you know, expansion that somebody did incorporating Twilight stuff.
Makes
definitely
sense. I just have to throw it out there.
Right.
I think I'm declaring that on this podcast, we can't bring up vampires unless we also bring up Twilight. I think it's a rule.
Okay. I'll accept that one begrudgingly. And yeah, to answer your question, there is a violent aspect to it, right? Like you can't talk about vampires without there being a violent component to it. Like they have to drink blood. You have to get it from somewhere. And that is definitely like part of the game. And I think like the thematic focus of the game is like the internal struggle of like trying to maintain your humanity versus like your instincts and your, you know, doing what you have to do. That is sort of the theme that's being presented, because you do have to feed your blood hunger, but at the same time, there's some kind of mechanic built into the game of like your humanity, and like if your humanity drops to 0, then it wasn't clear to me from what I was reading if you lose or if your character like dies, but like the character becomes something like past a vampire. They call it a wight. So like a wight it's a type of monster that like exists in different settings, but here they're using it for like a vampire who has completely lost touch with their humanity and they're just like a blood hungry monster now.
It sounds like it just makes you extra evil.
Yeah, definitely. It seems like the character would become evil, but I don't know if you stop playing though.
I see. What are the mechanics of this game like? Of course, the thing that I'm comparing it to in my head, like as far as the gameplay goes, is D&D. Like I'm thinking dice. I'm thinking, you know, a character sheet. So I'm curious what it's like for this game in particular.
Yeah, I didn't want to dive too deeply into each of these games because I would definitely take way too much time if I actually was trying to understand like the rules and all of that for every single game. But I did want to look into it a little bit because I also was curious, like if you're going to change up like what the play is like, then that has to be reflected somehow in the change in the mechanics. So I don't have a detailed answer, but there is definitely like a character creation process, and you create what kind of vampire you're going to be. So this involves choosing a clan, which represents some kind of collection of powers or like what cinematic version of a vampire you are. So I think there was one that's sort of like animal focused, and then there was another one that it was called like Nosferatu, and it's supposed to be more romantic, not in the like, you know, like more sort of like classical vampire. So I think there's these different clans, and that somehow is reflected. But I think a lot of the game is intended to happen through like social interaction, and then there's various times where your powers can be utilized to help you like get through certain scenarios better. When you do that, every time you use your powers, it like increases your hunger for blood, and then you have to feed that. And if you don't feed that, that's what brings you closer to becoming something called the beast. Yeah, and mechanically, there's definitely still dice, and I think I saw that they only use D10s for some reason. There is basically the same setup in that you have a character sheet, you choose specific features to choose what kind of character you are going to be, and then there's dice rolling that controls the way that things play out. And that's going to be true of all of these. They all have this basic framework of you create a character, it has certain specialties in some kind of way, and then you roll dice. And Vampire the Masquerade is set in a world called the World of Darkness, which is, it's basically supposed to be the real world, but there's lots of monsters in it. And it's also like a darker, gloomier version of the world. And there are other games set in this world made by the people who own the game. And there's like a werewolf game, and there's another one called like Hunter, which I assume that it's like a Monster Hunter type game. Yeah, it would be a good game for anybody who likes vampires, who likes sort of the darker, edgier sort of stuff. Okay, the next game is also an older one. It's even older than Vampire. This is the Call of Cthulhu. So you'll recognize the name. It is based on H.P. Lovecraft's work, and it is an investigative horror game. This is a game that is about confronting evil with nothing but your wits. So these characters that you create aren't going to be superpowered like they are in D&D. You're confronting evil, and you are discovering that you were never the main character in the first place. That's sort of the theme throughout Lovecraft's work. You know, what a lot of his work poses is that the evil things are sort of so big, so grand in scale that humans are like nothing, like actually nothing to them. They don't notice or care at all because it doesn't impact them. So this is a good game for people who love mystery and atmosphere of psychological tension. And if you wanted to play a campaign that feels more like X-Files than Lord of the Rings.
That sounds really cool. I think I would be into that one a lot.
Yeah.
The vampire one, I'd give it a shot, but this one sounds more up my alley.
Yeah, I think I'm excited about the prospect of playing this one too, because I'm the perpetual DM in our group, and something I'm really interested. I've like tried to come up with how to do it is to do like a murder mystery in D&D, and basically the game is not set up for that. There aren't really rules and mechanics set up for how to handle a murder mystery. So it would just be sort of making it up, But this game is about investigation. And so it's sort of built into it that it has the rules to handle such a thing. So this is, again, set in a gloomier version of the real world. There are some fun names that they use that replace the names that D&D uses for things. So the game master in this game is called the Keeper of Arcane Lore, and players are called Investigators of the Unknown. So when you create a character, you're going to choose from some realistic skills like library use, spotting hidden things, and psychology, knowledge of psychology. And your character can have professions like journalist, professor, detective, or artist. There's no hit points and there's no levels. And so your character is not becoming tougher and, harder to kill as the game goes along. What does happen as the game progresses is you learn more and more facts about the horrors of the world and how irrelevant humanity is. And as you do so, you lose sanity points. So this is one of the mechanics of the game, is called sanity points. And every time you encounter a monster or you learn something horrific, you lose sanity points. And this is like one of the main mechanics of the game. So this game has actually a reputation for player characters either getting, brutally killed or ending up in a mental hospital because they lose all their sanity points. So it has a reputation of being a little bit brutal on the characters, and winning is not always guaranteed. The next one I'm going to tell you about is called Blades in the Dark. So I had never heard of this one before. I've heard of the other two because they're pretty famous within the space. But Blades in the Dark is a relatively new one. So this was actually funded on Kickstarter in 2015. So it's relatively new compared to the other ones. And this is a game that's all about heists and criminal organizations and long-term group storytelling. So in this game, you create a crew of scoundrels who are doing the dirty work in a haunted industrial city. So you're not heroes, you're criminals who are trying to survive, trying to expand your turf, and climb the underworld food chain. The core fantasy in this game is organized crime, but supernatural. So think of The Lies of Lamora, if you're familiar with that. So you create a crew, which is going to be a gang of thieves, smugglers, cultists, assassins, or revolutionaries. And each player character has a playbook, like the Cutter, which is like a fighter type, the Slide, who's a con artist, or the Whisperer, who's a ghost handler. The crew itself also levels up as you go along, and you gain turf, allies, and special abilities over time. Progress in the game is tracked with clocks. So these are like visual timers for things like the amount of suspicion you have on you from enemies, stuff to do with turf wars, or magical rituals that are, going to be completed in a certain amount of time. And then players have to manage stress, which is a resource that they use to power their special moves. If you take too much stress, then this leads to trauma and long-term consequences. Another thing is, if you think about a heist movie, then they have to plan their heist first. And usually you see that planning phase first. I mean, the first thing is like getting the team together, and then they plan it, and then they go do the heist, and that's like the climax of the movie. In that wouldn't be as fun as a game. And so what this game does to like have to balance both of those things is you jump right into the heist, right into the activity itself. And if there's ever a thing that would like narratively make sense to have been planned, then you play a flashback. So you switch to flashback mode and you continue playing, but you could play in the flashback, and that's like the planning phase. And then you flash forward back into the real time, and the consequences of that flashback take place.
That's really cool. That's an awesome game mechanic, I think. Something that might be cool to incorporate in D&D too. Like if there's something, I guess it kind of happens in like within metagaming, like why is your character making that choice, or why is this happening to your character? And then you're able to like sort of outside of the game explain why it's happening. But I like the idea of it being a flashback. I think that's really cool.
Right. Yeah, it is a really cool mechanic. One thing that I sort of get the sense from this, and I think people do this, is like in the middle of your D&D game, if you want to suddenly run a heist, then maybe you can just like switch the game mechanics for one session, not on the spot, but like for the next session, you say like, okay, we're planning a heist, and in the next session, you run this game system to play out that event. And it would be more fun because like it's set up for heists, and D&D is not set up for heists. And then after that, you switch back to. And you can do that like with other games too for other types of mechanics. And I think people do that, and it probably turns out well. So the last game I wanted to tell you about is a very, very new one called Daggerheart. And in fact, this game is so new, it's published in May of 2025, that I'm not even sure about all of the information because there's not very much online that like spells out every detail of the way that the game works. And, it's too new for a lot of people to have developed a solid opinion on it yet. But this game is produced by Darrington Press, which is the publishing arm of Critical Role. So Matt Mercer's Critical Role, it's a very famous actual play online video D&D series. And so they started a publishing arm called Darrington Press, and they just put out this game. A little bit of drama tied to it is that they recently hired 2 new people to be, I don't forget their titles, but something like, game designer, head of game design, or something like that. These 2 people being Chris Perkins and Jeremy Crawford. So people who are familiar with like modern Dungeons and Dragons know those are the 2 main game designers who worked at Wizards of the Coast to develop 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, the one that we've been playing.
So they were poached?
They were poached, or I think they were poached. Allegedly. Yeah, I mean, they definitely, I remember they announced a few months ago, like, that they were leaving Wizards of the Coast, and that was kind of dramatic because Wizards of the Coast just put out a massive update to 5th edition. People call it like the 2024 rules, or like 5.5 edition, and then they announced that they're leaving. So Jeremy Crawford and Chris Perkins, and those were the guys who basically were in charge of 5th edition.
I wonder what the legality of it is, like if they signed something like an NDA or basically something that says like you can't use what you created here at Wizards of the Coast for any future job or any future opportunity.
Like a non-compete clause.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Because a lot of industries have that.
Right. I mean, yeah, obviously they don't, it doesn't seem like they have a non-compete in the sense of like when you quit your job, you can't work for a competitor for X number of years. So like it's clearly not that. But yeah, I'm sure that like, using D&D's content definitely has like certain legal bars on it.
I'm also curious, like, what is the limit? Like, where do you draw the line? Because D&D has inspired, I'm sure, a lot of like TTRPGs. And what is them using, whatever they made or learned at Wizards of the Coast, and what is just overall inspiration from D&D as a whole? You know what I mean?
Right. I think that there's a lot of precedent to point to. So we didn't really do. I haven't talked about the history of D&D itself. Right. I talked about the prehistory, and then I talked about things other than D&D now. But another story entirely is just how D&D went from original edition to today. Very, very complicated, like legally speaking. Like people leaving, people making a new thing, Gary Gygax getting pushed out of the company or leaving it and then like doing his own thing, and like very, very complicated. So like I think that the idea of like what belongs to D&D and what is simply inspired by and legally perfectly fine to be its own thing has been very well hashed out many, many times over several decades.
Maybe we'll hear about that on another episode.
Maybe, yeah. Yeah, in terms of Daggerheart specifically, I think that an interesting thing related to your question is that they published the game, the original version of the game, in May, and I think that those 2 guys got hired like officially right after that. So they like very technically speaking did not develop the game. Matthew Mercer developed the game, probably with like a whole bunch of other people.
That makes sense.
And then now they are brought on to continue keeping up the quality of the game. Or I don't know what they're doing moving forward, but I'm sure they're developing a lot of new content and like updating things and stuff like that for Daggerheart.
Yeah, I mean that does sort of solve the, I guess the problem that I was posing first. But now I'm wondering if that was intentional. If these two guys were like, yes, we want to come on, yes, we want to work with you, but it can't be until after you establish the game and you release it because of that gray area, because of where they were working before.
That's a good point. It could be the case that like in their contracts it says like, and maybe they do have some version of a non-compete clause where it says like, okay, yeah, it's fine if you leave and you go join another game company that already has a game out, but what you can't do is leave and like start a new game from scratch.
Right.
Maybe it said something like that. I don't know.
Maybe. We're speculating.
Yeah, so let me actually tell you about the game a little bit. So this game is really more of an alternative to D&D than the previous games I mentioned have been. Those have been like playing a completely different game that's just also tabletop role-playing. This one is really more similar to D&D in the sense that it's still like epic fantasy, like you're talking about fantasy races, elves and orcs and all that stuff, and you're still going to be like some kind of spellcaster or some kind of fighter person, and it's going to have a combat component that's pretty important. But basically, they wanted to rethink the way that the game is structured, the mechanics of the game. So when you create your character, it has a lot of similarities to D&D in that like you don't pick a class, but you do pick an archetype, and so this is more like your role within the party. So like a guardian or a trickster. And you pick your heritage, which is a combination of ancestry and community. So this is sort of replacing the notion of race and background. I will mention that one example of a ancestry that they introduced in the game is a frog people, and they are called ribbit. So you are a ribbit fighter or whatever it is. And then you have another feature called your calling, which is your personal motivation. A major thing that they introduce in this game is the use of cards. So this is a thing that has sort of existed in Dungeons and Dragons as an add-on, as like a third-party addition to the game that people have made up. But it's basically, they have cards that are a core element of the game that have your character's abilities on them. You pick your class and your subclass and your heritage and your domain stuff, and all of these things come with certain abilities as you'd expect in something like D&D, but these have cards, and so you just get a bunch of cards that have all of your abilities on them. Another mechanic that's unique to Daggerheart is that they have two 12-sided die that you roll instead of a d20. So in all the places when you would normally roll a d20 in Dungeons and Dragons, you roll these two 12-sided die, and they're different colors. One of them is your hope die, and the other one is your fear die. And so if you think about it, if you roll two 12s, it adds up to 24. So it's pretty close to a d20 in terms of what numbers can come out. The distribution of those numbers is different, but a major part is when you roll these two, you add them together, and that's your total score. So it doesn't matter which one is higher or anything like that. You roll the two and you add them up. That gives you your number. That determines whether or not you fail or succeed. What they do add, though, is whichever one of those is higher, your hope or your fear, you report that as part of your roll. So like if you roll a 7 and an 8, and the 7 was the hope and the 8 was the fear, then you add them up, you say 15, fear. And what that does is, like, if 15 was good and you beat it, then it's like, okay, you succeed. But the fear gives, like, a fear, I don't know, point or something to the Dungeon Master. And now the Dungeon Master can use that to introduce something else into the game. Even if you don't roll very well, The game also is designed in a way where it's not a failure. Like the thing that, the story is still going to move forward, but it might be more complex because you rolled low. This is an idea called failing forward that has been used in the TTRPG space for a long time. And that's really like characteristic of the design overall of this game, is that it's like D&D, but with a heavier emphasis on narrative and storytelling and making things cinematic and vibes and just overall the feeling and the story, building a story out of all of the stuff that you're building together as a group. So that game sounds really cool. It sounds really exciting, and like Matthew Mercer is a great DM, and so if he's, leading the development of this game, and I'm sure it's going to be very exciting. And I've seen a lot of YouTube videos. A lot of people are putting out videos about this game, reviewing it, and they've gotten advanced copies and played through, their own games of it. And it sounds really cool. So I'm excited to try this out. A lot of stuff that I've talked about could be false because I'm just trying to gather information from wherever I could. But if, whatever I'm hearing is true, then it sounds really cool.
It sounds like it's more of a competitor to D&D than some of the other games that you talked about. I'm curious to see how much it will be embraced by D&D players. I mean, obviously the people who are fans of Critical Role will be like, hell yeah. But I'm curious to see how long it takes for it to leave that circle or that community, and if it'll gain popularity with D&D players outside of people that are fans of Critical Role.
I think that the history of Dungeons and Dragons, as I alluded to, is complex. Something that I found out during my research for today's episode is that a game called Pathfinder, which is another sort of competitor to D&D, was actually outselling D&D for a very long time. Pathfinder actually it came out of D&D. It was developed by people who worked on D&D. And yeah, like I said, it outsold D&D for a number of years. So it is very possible for Daggerheart to basically repeat that history in some sense, where people from D&D came over to help develop it, right? And now they're building something, and a lot of people are very critical of Dungeons and Dragons. It has a complex history. It has a lot of baggage attached to it. Anything like that is going to have a hard time. So if something new can come out and say we love D&D, but we get to change the name and therefore drop the baggage and then do whatever we want and be more experimental with, new features, things that more reflect the game that people want to play, right? Because the game that people want to play today is not the game that Gary Gygax wanted to play in the 70s, right? He was playing war games and he just made a fantasy war game. That's a very, very different game than what people are playing today. So if they can say, we're going to make our own new game, heavily inspired, but it doing its own thing, and if that can be successful, then I think that's fantastic. And that's ultimately what I wanted to get at with this episode, with this topic, is to say it doesn't have to be D&D. You can play tabletop role-playing games that are suited to what you want to do, the kind of game that you want to play. And you can have a variety of experiences and a variety of gameplay mechanics. So that was my topic.
I'm glad I got to hear about these games because I didn't know about any of them, I think. So I'm excited to potentially play in the future. If any of you have played any of these games, let us know what you think. We're curious. Because as Joe said, we haven't played yet. So yeah, but thank you. This was great.
Yeah, I'm glad to share it, and I'm looking forward to playing it with you too. Now, I'm curious, what is your topic for today?
So on today's episode, I'm going to be talking about an icon, a legend, a man who is the moment. Just kidding. I don't know. So if you, like myself, grew up in Mexico, or grew up in a Mexican household, then you know who Chespirito is. His legal name is Roberto Gomez Bolaños, and he is best known for his work as the creator of a very, very popular comedy show from the 70s called El Chavo del Ocho. So I picked this topic because I'm currently watching his bio series on HBO Max. It's called Chespirito Sin Querer Queriendo, which is one of his like catchphrases from the show. In English, the show is called Chespirito Not Really on Purpose, which isn't really the perfect translation for that saying, but I suppose it's good enough. So the show itself is a bio series, and it talks about his upbringing and his career and how his very famous shows and characters came to be. It also, at the same time, revived some of the drama that surrounded his marriage at the time, which honestly people are eating it up on TikTok, everywhere online. It's become a very hot topic because there's infidelity involved, and so people like to talk about it. But I think overall he's had a really interesting life and, of course, an iconic career. So, and he's also a huge part of a lot of people's childhood, like people that grew up in Mexico or are Mexican. And his work is embedded into Mexican culture in a way that not a lot of shows are. You know, all of his work, his style of comedy, everything is like synonymous to Mexican culture. So that's why I want to talk about him today. So I'll start with his early life. As I mentioned, his, government name is Roberto Gomez Bolaños, and he was born on February 21st, 1929 in Mexico City. He came from a creative family. His dad was a painter and an illustrator. Also, as a random fun fact that Wikipedia wanted me to know, he was apparently the first cousin once removed of the president of Mexico from 1964 to 1970. His name is Gustavo Díaz Ordaz. He also has a younger brother. He has a few brothers, but the one that comes up the most because he was also on the show, and I think they were really close. His younger brother is named Horacio Gomez Bolaños, and he also portrayed a character in the show El Chavo del Ocho. So in his younger years, Chespirito was an amateur boxer, and he actually studied mechanical engineering at UNAM before he decided to switch paths with his career. The nickname Chespirito was actually given to him by colleagues who were impressed by his writing. It's basically, it's portrayed kind of in a funny way in the show, but it basically comes from the fact that somebody called him Little Shakespeare because his writing was so good. So then that sort of, in the Spanish language became Chespirito, like Chespirito. So the name kind of stuck and he went with it because he's also a very short person. So like, I think that's also where it came from. Like, he's a short dude, he's a really good writer. They call him, Little Shakespeare. And then that turned into Shakespearito, which turned into Chespirito. And that's the name that he adopted for his career.
That's really funny. That's really cool. I like that story.
Another kind of random fun fact about the beginning of his career. Apparently, he landed his first job in media sort of by accident. So he saw an ad that an ad agency was hiring, and so he went to go, see if he could work there. But he ended up choosing the wrong line, like the shorter line, and he ended up actually sort of interviewing and applying for a job in TV production instead. And that's how he ended up at his first media job. We're going to skip forward a little bit and talk a little bit about his career and sort of like his rise to fame with his shows. So he started out with this show called Los Supergenios de la Mesa Cuadrada, which translates to the super geniuses of the square table. The show was airing in 1968, and it's a sketch show featuring other emerging stars. I'm going to be referencing the bio series a lot, so I'll just get that out of the way. So the bio series portrays this show, Los Supergenios de la Mesa Cuadrada, as a show that it was funny and people enjoyed it, but it also got to be a little heady. Like the writing in it wasn't as widely appealing as the network wanted it to be. So he had a little bit of tension with the executives at the network where the show aired because it wasn't exactly what they wanted him to do. So the show itself, Los Supergenios, despite it, maybe not being the network's favorite thing, it actually continued on, and it was later renamed Chespirito y la Mesa Cuadrada, and then it was later once more renamed just Chespirito. And that show itself was where the sketches came from of some of his most popular characters that are like still super widely recognized. So some of the iconic characters that this show introduced are Dr. Chapatin, who's kind of like a grumpy old doctor. So his whole thing, I guess, is that he's always worried, he's always nervous, and he has a paper bag that he breathes into. And honestly, this is also where things do start to get a lot more slapsticky, physical humor and all of that with this character and with some of the other characters that I'll talk about. The next character is called El Chapulín Colorado, which translates to the red cricket. And this character is from 1970. El Chapulín Colorado is kind of a clueless superhero. He has his weapon is a squeaky hammer. So in most episodes or in most sketches, they would portray somebody in danger, and El Chapulín Colorado comes in through the window and he says his catchphrase, which, no contaban con mi astucia, which means like, you didn't see this coming. Like you didn't, you weren't counting on my, what's astucia? Like basically saying like, you weren't expecting me to show up type of thing, I don't know if that's an exact translation, so just bear with me. And he looks super dorky. He's like, his whole outfit is all red. He has like, imagine like red tights, yellow shorts, a red shirt with a big heart in the middle that has CH for Chapulín Colorado. And he has like little antennas. And overall, super stupid, isn't going to save anyone. Just very, very funny. I think that some of his best like physical humor came from that character in particular. It's really funny. So the last character or the last sketch within the show that I'll talk about is El Chavo del Ocho, which is the one that I'm really going to dig into today. So El Chavo del Ocho is supposed to be a little kid, and he is an orphan, and he lives inside a barrel in a neighborhood. So he's supposed to be kind of innocent. He's a child, so he's always getting into trouble. He's always messing with his neighbors. At the same time, he's really innocent, and so you can't help but feel for him because he's such a lovable character. The character of El Chavo went on to have its own show, basically, like a spin-off from the sketch show, and El Chavo del Ocho was one of Chespirito's like most recognized characters and shows. I did want to talk a little bit more about some of the other characters in the El Chavo del Ocho show. So I've already discussed El Chavo, played by Chespirito. He's poor, he's kind-hearted, he's always hungry, and his favorite food is a torta de jamón, which is a ham sandwich. The title of the bio series, Sin Querer, Queriendo, is one of his catchphrases. It's basically when he does something bad and he's getting reprimanded for it, he's getting yelled at for it by his neighbors. He says, fue sin querer queriendo, which is like, like I did it on purpose, but like not really on purpose type of thing. It's a way for him to like, be like, it wasn't me, or not it wasn't me, but for him to excuse himself, I guess. So another character is La Chilindrina. She's played by María Antonieta de las Nieves, who was one of the actresses who was in Los Supergenios de la Mesa Cuadrada his very first show. La Chilindrina is a smart, mischievous girl with pigtails, like uneven pigtails. She has freckles and a missing front tooth. She's also the daughter of Don Ramon, who is another member of the neighborhood or vecindad where El Chavo lives. She's known for being clever, whiny, and manipulative, but also very tender with El Chavo. She is like his best friend, essentially. If you know the show, you know that La Chilindrina has a very signature cry, which I will not be doing, but you can look that up, and it's very funny. The next character is Don Ramon, who is her dad. He's portrayed as being unemployed, sort of grumpy, always very sarcastic, and he's constantly late on rent. That's like a plot point in almost every single episode. Little bit of a deadbeat, but we love him. He's also frequently at odds and being scolded by this other character named Doña Florinda. They're like sworn enemies. They hate each other. The next character is Doña Florinda. Doña Florinda is played by an actress named Florinda Meza. So Doña Florinda is like the snooty, kind of elitist character in the neighborhood. She's very dramatic. She has a son. His name is Kiko. And she's constantly spoiling him. Her signature look is an apron and some rollers in her hair. Like she's perpetually getting ready for something. She's kind of annoying, but gotta love her. The next character is Kiko. He is played by Carlos Villagran. Kiko is Doña Florinda's son. So Kiko is very pouty. He's very spoiled. He's like the rich kid of the neighborhood. Like he has all the toys. He has all the nice things, and he doesn't like to share them. His signature thing, and I don't know where this came from, is that his cheeks are puffed up. And I think the actor who plays him does that himself. Actually, he puffs up his cheeks in order to play Kiko, and so he looks really funny because his cheeks are literally always puffed up. He's obsessed with his soccer ball, and he's also obsessed with one-upping El Chavo. The next character is Professor Girafales, played by Ruben Aguirre. Again, one of the original cast members from his sketch show. He's a tall, mustached school teacher who courts Doña Florinda with roses, and he stops by for coffee. Like every single episode, he brings her flowers and is here just to have a cup of coffee. He just wants to hang out with this girl. He's also, like I said, a teacher. He's the kids' teacher, and so there are scenes where they're in school and hijinks ensue, and he's there. One of his signature things is that when he gets frustrated, he has a particular thing he does. He goes da 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 da, like TATA, and that's his way of gathering the children and being like, "Hey, stop that!" And it's really funny. The next character is Señor Barriga, played by Edgar Vivar. First of all, Barriga means tummy, so I think you guys can put two and two together. This character is a big man, and as everybody knows, being fat is hilarious. So he was always the butt of the joke. He's actually the landlord for the neighborhood, which maybe landlords could stand to be the butt of the joke more often, but a lot of the jokes did center around his body. He's there for one reason and one reason only, to collect rent. Don Ramon never has it. The kids always end up making him trip or doing something to him when he's there to collect rent. Okay, the last character I wanted to talk about is Doña Clotilde, who is also known in the show as La Bruja del 71, which means the Witch of 71. She's kind of an older lady. She's played by the actress Angelines Fernandez. So she's an elderly woman who lives by herself, and she has a crush on Don Ramon. So she's always kind of looking at him with hard eyes. She's also always trying to prove that she's not a witch, but all of her mysterious mannerisms say otherwise, and all the kids think she's a witch. So El Chavo del Ocho was an incredibly popular show when it first came out, and over half of Mexico's TV sets tuned in at peak times, and El Chavo reached 350 million viewers per episode across Latin America. So it was a huge deal, and it still continues to be a huge deal. I'm sure, I don't live in Mexico anymore, but when I did as a kid, it was still playing on TV like nonstop. And that was in the early 2000s. So, and the show's from the 70s. So it's had incredible lasting power. I also had a few kind of random fun facts. Apparently, The Simpsons creator, Matt Groening, has said that he created the character Bumblebee Man after watching El Chapulín Colorado in a motel on the Mexico-United States border.
It's really interesting how many of those characters, you said every episode they do the same thing. It seems like very in line with like the philosophy that like putting in restrictions increases your ability to be creative in any kind of like creative scenario. If you impose restrictions on yourselves, it gives you more creativity.
Yeah, I think for me, it's the kind of thing that I honestly didn't really think about until much, much later. Because I grew up watching the show, it never struck me as something that was different or interesting about it. It was literally like, that's the cadence of the show and that's how it was created. But the show has such distinct beats in a way that I haven't seen any other show. Like, I think maybe it's also like a thing of the time, right? For in TV shows back then, for the character to have a catchphrase, for episodes to be structured all in a very similar way. But he definitely took it to the next level, because I'm telling you, I never knew the order of things. Like there's definitely like an overarching narrative, but it's not super important. You could be watching an episode. The show went on for a while, so you could be watching an episode from like the very beginning, and then right after they would play one from like the 90s, and you would still be like, oh, they're the same, because the show had such specific beats, and that's the way that he wrote it. But it also, of course, made the characters super recognizable, and I think that was one of the ingredients in the sauce for it to become such an iconic piece of like Mexican comedy. And all of those sayings, all of those jokes, sin querer queriendo, the ta ta ta, all of those, like the way that La Chilindrina cries, like they have so much recognition. Like there's almost no Mexican person that doesn't know what that is, because it's so embedded in the culture. So now I'll talk a little bit about his relationships and kind of the drama surrounding that. So he married his first wife, Graciela Fernandez, in 1968, and they had 6 children together, and then they divorced in 1989. He began a relationship with his co-star, Florinda Meza, who played Doña Florinda, in 1977. And yes, there was overlap, as you can tell by the years, and he ended up marrying her in 2004. The bioseries itself has stirred up some drama again surrounding Chespirito's infidelity. The show itself depicts him courting or flirting with Florinda Meza while he was still married. And Florinda Meza also at the time was engaged to the producer of the show. His name is Enrique Segoviano. So everything was sort of like going down in front of both Enrique, who was engaged to Florinda, and Graciela, who was married to Chespirito. So it was, they were both stepping out. So as I said, eventually he got divorced. Eventually he married Florinda Meza. But a lot of people sort of cite his relationship with her as one of the reasons why El Chavo ended, why the show ended, because Florinda Meza had a lot of conflict with a lot of the other characters. People say that she basically got in his ear, and of course had a lot of control over that, being that they were in a relationship. And there's all sorts of allegations about that. So that is one of the things that the show has sort of brought up back into the surface. And she was interviewed and she talked about it. She was in opposition of the show and the way that she was portrayed in the show. So it's kind of a mess, but I'll get more into that a little bit later. So Chespirito actually retired from television in 1995, but he still remained active in theater, film, and writing in many other ways. He suffered from Parkinson's later in his life, and he died of a heart failure on November 28th, 2014. His funeral was actually held at Estadio Azteca, which is a huge stadium, and it was attended by 40,000 fans, and many of them were dressed as his characters. He left, as I said, a massive legacy. All of his catchphrases and characters remained ingrained in all of Latin American culture. To sort of bring it back to the series, the HBO Max series called Chespirito, Sin Querer, Queriendo, I have a few things that might be, of interest, just like fun facts. So the series debuted in June of 2025. It's an 8-episode miniseries. It was written and produced by his children, and it blends realism and fantasy, drawing on unpublished family archives. A lot of the stories in the show are drawn from his memoir. Going back to Florinda Meza, who, he had a relationship with while he was still married, and who he married in the early 2000s. She was very critical of the show, and she actually didn't want any involvement in it. And one of the things that ended up happening was a legal battle over how she was going to be represented. And eventually, there was a lot of drama regarding that, especially because his kids were putting together the show. And I think there was already tension there. It's a sore spot from the past. So they ended up coming to a settlement, which was that she is represented in the show, but they essentially created a fictional character, somebody named Margarita Ruiz, who represents Florinda Meza. Like in the storyline, it's 100% her. But I guess that was good enough for her to not be named. Because she said that it was going to be a misrepresentation of how everything happened between her and Chespirito and the cheating and all of that. I will say, side note, there is a viral clip going around right now because all of this has been drummed up again on TikTok. I've seen it a few times already, actually. And every time I see it, it makes me kind of sad. Where I think it's in the early 2000s when they maybe already were married or maybe we're about to be, I don't know. It's an interview with Chespirito and Florinda Meza, and they're talking about the show. Maybe they're talking about, I don't know the full context of the interview, but basically she says, she's talking about when she first got together with him, and she says, when I met him or when we started whatever, I told him he had 7 defects, 6 kids, and a wife. And he, his face in that interview when he realizes what she said is like, what the hell? And he's like, no, what do you mean defects? Like, why would you call them that? And he gets he gets mad in the interview, like, what is wrong with this woman? So a lot of people are finding more stuff like that goes to prove that maybe she wasn't that great of a person. So she's not very well liked amongst Latinos right now. So I personally think she's a hater because the show is actually really good. I think it's really cute. And I swear this episode is not sponsored by HBO Max. It just is a really good show. And I really like Chespirito. But if HBO Max did want to sponsor us, that would be cool. But yeah, that's all I have for today. I hope you enjoyed learning about Chespirito and all the world that he created. And his legacy is a little complicated, but there's no doubt that, like I said, his work has had such a huge impact on so many people's lives. So
yeah, that was super interesting. I've always seen El Chavo, and I didn't know any of the history behind it.
So that's it for today's episode. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram. We're at brainworms_pod. We're also on TikTok at brainworms_pod. Also, please leave a comment on Spotify, if you will.
Thank you for listening.
We'll see you on the next episode. Bye.
Bye.